Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Alexa. Thank you so much for watching my video today. This is Eckhart Tolle's A New Earth, Chapter 4, Role-Playing and the Many Faces of the Ego Explained. Please like and subscribe and click the bell so you'll be notified when I upload new videos. Okay, so I hope you have your popcorn because this is going to get really good. Chapter 4, Role-Playing the Many Faces of the Ego. An ego that wants something from another and what ego doesn't will usually play some kind of role to get its needs met, be they material gain, a sense of power, superiority, or specialness, or some kind of special gratification, be it physical or psychological. Usually people are completely unaware of the roles they play. They are those roles. Some roles are subtle, others are blatantly obvious, except to the person playing it. Some roles are designed to simply get attention from others. The ego thrives on others' attention, which is, after all, a form of psychic energy. The ego doesn't know that the source of all energy is within you, so it seeks it from outside. It is not the formless attention which is presence that the ego seeks, but attention in some form, such as recognition, praise, admiration, or just to be noticed in some way to have its existence acknowledged. Any conceptual sense of self, seeing myself as this or that, is ego, whether predominantly positive, such as I am the greatest, or negative, such as I am no good. Behind every positive self-concept is the hidden fear of not being good enough. Behind every negative self-concept is the hidden desire of being the greatest or better than others. Being the confident ego's feeling of and continuing need for superiority is the unconscious fear of inferiority. Conversely, the shy, inadequate ego that feels inferior has a strong hidden desire for superiority. Many people fluctuate between feelings of inferiority and superiority, depending on situations or the people they come into contact with. All you need to know and observe in yourself is this: whenever you feel superior or inferior to anyone, that is the ego in you. Eckhart Tolle continues Chapter 4 with a section titled Villain, Victim, Lover. In this section, Eckhart Tolle examines how when some egos cannot get the praise or admiration that they are looking for in a particular situation, they may seek negative attention instead. One form of this that is very common is the role of the victim. The attention, sympathy, pity that comes with people's interest in my problems and me and my story. Seeing oneself as a victim is an element in many egoic patterns, such as complaining, being offended, outraged, and so on. Of course, once I am identified with a story in which I assigned myself the role of the victim, I don't want it to end. And so, as every therapist knows, the ego does not want an end to its problems because they are a part of its identity. If no one else will listen to my sad story, I can tell it to myself in my head over and over and feel sorry for myself. And so I have an identity as someone who is being treated unfairly by life or other people, fate, or God. It gives definition to my self-image, makes me into someone, and that is all that matters to the ego. Eckhart Tolle continues this section by explaining how the ego plays a role in our romantic relationships. In the early stages of many so-called romantic relationships, role-playing is quite common in order to attract and keep whoever is perceived by the ego as the one who is going to make me happy, make me feel special, and fulfill all of my needs. I'll play who you want me to be, and you'll play who I want you to be. That's the unspoken and unconscious agreement. However, role-playing is hard work, and so those roles cannot be sustained indefinitely, especially once you start living together. When those roles slip, what do you see? Unfortunately, in most cases, not yet the true essence of that being, but that which covers up the true essence, the raw ego, divested of its roles, with its pain body, its thwarted wanting, which now turns into anger, most likely directed at the spouse or partner for having failed to remove the underlying fear and sense of lack that is an intrinsic part of the ego's sense of self. Eckhart Tolle goes on to describe the experience of falling in love as an intensification of egoic wanting and needing. What is commonly called falling in love is in most cases an intensification of egoic wanting and needing. You become addicted to another person, or rather your image of that person. It has nothing to do with true love, which contains no wanting whatsoever. The Spanish language, in most honest regard to the conventional notions of love, te quiero means I want you, as well as I love you. The other expression for I love you, te amo, which does not have this ambiguity, is rarely used, perhaps because true love is just as rare. Eckhart Tolle continues Chapter 4 with a section titled Letting Go of Self-Definitions. In this section, the author examines how during the development of humanity, class systems were developed. People would take on certain functions, and that function would become their identity. There were priests, warriors, merchants, farmers, laborers, and so on. On this subject, Eckhart Tolle contends, your function, which in most cases you were born into, determined your identity, determined who you were in the eyes of others, as well as in your own eyes. Your function became a role, but it wasn't recognized as a role. It was who you were, or thought you were. Only rare beings at the time, such as Buddha or Jesus, saw the ultimate irrelevance of caste or social class, recognized it as identification with form, and saw that such identification with the conditioned and the temporal obscured the light of the unconditioned and eternal that shines in each human being. The author continues this section by explaining how this class system is less rigid and less clearly defined in our contemporary society, and how this has created a society where people are no longer automatically assigned a function and with it an identity, resulting in a modern world where more and more people are confused as to where they fit in, what their purpose is, and even who they are. Eckhart Tolle continues Chapter 4 with a section titled Pre-Established Roles. Of course, different people fulfill different functions in this world. It cannot be otherwise. As far as intellectual or physical abilities are concerned, knowledge, skills, talent, and energy levels, human beings differ widely. What really matters is not what function you fulfill in this world, but whether you identify with your function to such an extent that it takes you over and becomes a role that you play. When you play roles, you are unconscious. When you catch yourself playing a role, that recognition creates a space between you and that role. It is the beginning of freedom from the role. When you are completely identified with a role, you confuse a pattern of behavior with who you are, and you take yourself very seriously. You also automatically assign roles to others that correspond to yours. For example, when you visit doctors who are totally identified with their role, to them you will not be a human being, but a patient or a case history. Although the social structures in the contemporary world are less rigid than in ancient cultures, there are still many pre-established functions or roles that people readily identify with, and which thus become part of the ego. This causes human interactions to become inauthentic, dehumanized, and alienating. Those pre-established roles may give you a somewhat comforting sense of identity, but ultimately you lose yourself in them. The functions people have in hierarchical organizations, such as the military, the church, a government institution, or large corporation, easily lend themselves to become role identities. Authentic human interactions become impossible when you lose yourself in a role. Eckhart Tolle continues by discussing social archetypes such as the middle-class housewife, the tough macho male, the female seductress, the nonconformist, and the artist or performer. The author explains how we as Americans were a predominantly conformist society during the 1950s until the uprising of the hippie movement during the 1960s, when many of the Western world's young people rejected the cultural norms. The hippie movement that originated on the west coast of the United States in the 1960s and then spread throughout the Western world came out of many young people's rejection of social archetypes, of roles, of pre-established patterns of behavior, as well as egoically based social and economic structures. They refused to play the roles their parents and society wanted to impose on them. Significantly, it coincided with the horrors of the Vietnam War, in which more than 57,000 young Americans and 3 million Vietnamese died, and through which the insanity of the system and the underlying mindset was exposed for all to see. Whereas in the 1950s, most Americans were still extremely conformist in thought and behaviors, in the 1960s, millions of people began to withdraw their identification with the collective conceptual identity because the insanity of the collective was so obvious. The hippie movement represented a loosening of the hitherto rigid egoic structures in the psyche of humanity. The movement itself degenerated and came to an end, but it left behind an opening, and not just in those who were part of the movement. This made it possible for ancient Eastern wisdom and spirituality to move west and play an essential part in the awakening of global consciousness. Eckhart Tolle continues Chapter 4 with a section titled Temporary Roles. In this section, the author explains how we as humans unconsciously play out different roles in our daily lives. If you are awake enough, aware enough to be able to observe how you interact with other people, you may detect subtle changes in your speech, attitude, and behavior depending on the person you are interacting with. At first, it may be easier to observe this in others. Then, you may also detect it in yourself. The way in which you speak to the chairman of the company may be different in subtle ways from how you speak to the janitor. How you speak to a child may be different from how you speak to an adult. Why is that? You are playing roles. You are not yourself, neither with the chairman, nor with the janitor, nor with the child. When you walk into a store to buy something, when you go to a restaurant, the bank, the post office, you may find yourself slipping into pre-established social roles. You become a customer and speak and act as such, and you may be treated by the salesperson or waiter who is also playing a role as a customer. A range of conditioned patterns of behavior come into effect between two human beings that determine the nature of the interaction. Instead of being human beings, conceptual mental images are interacting with each other. The more identified people are with their respective roles, the more inauthentic the relationships become. You have a mental image not only of the other person, but also of who you are, especially in relation to the person you are interacting with. So you are not relating with that person at all, but who you think you are is relating to who you think the other person is, and vice versa. The conceptual image your mind has made of yourself is relating to its own creation, in which the conceptual image it has made of the other person. The conceptual image your mind has made of yourself is relating to its own creation, which is the conceptual image it has made of the other person. The other person's mind has probably done the same. And so every egoic interaction between two people is in reality the interaction between four conceptual mind-made identities that are ultimately fictions. It is therefore not surprising that there is so much conflict in relationships. There is no true relationship. Wrap your brain around that one. In the next section titled Happiness as a Role versus True Happiness, Eckhart Tolle explores the difference between authentic joy and the illusion of happiness. In many cases, happiness is a role people play, and behind the smiling facade, there is a great deal of pain. Depression, breakdowns, and overreactions are common when unhappiness is covered up behind a smiling exterior and brilliant white teeth. When there is denial, sometimes even to one's self, that there is much unhappiness. Just fine is a role the ego plays more commonly in America than in certain other countries, where being and looking miserable is almost the norm and therefore more socially acceptable. If there is unhappiness in you, first you need to acknowledge that it is there, but don't say, "I'm unhappy." Unhappiness has nothing to do with who you really are. Say, instead, "There is unhappiness in me," and then investigate it. A situation you find yourself in may have something to do with it. Action may be required to change the situation or remove yourself from it. If there is nothing you can do, face what is and say, "Well, right now this is how it is, and I can either accept it or I can make myself miserable." The primary cause of unhappiness is never this situation, but your thoughts about it. Be aware of the thoughts you are thinking. Separate them from the situation, which is always neutral, which always is as it is. There is the situation or the fact, and here are my thoughts about it. Instead of making up stories, stay with the facts. For example, "I am ruined" is a story. It limits you and prevents you from taking effective action. "I have 50 cents left in my bank account" is a fact. Facing facts is always empowering. Be aware that what you think, to a large extent, creates the emotions that you feel. See the link between your thinking and your emotions. Rather than being your thoughts and emotions, be the awareness behind them. Don't seek happiness. If you seek it, you won't find it, because seeking is the antithesis of happiness. Happiness is ever elusive, but freedom from unhappiness is attainable now, by facing what is rather than making up stories about it. Unhappiness covers up your natural state of well-being and inner peace, the source of true happiness. In the next section, Parenthood, Role or Function, Eckhart Tolle examines the egoic role-playing dynamic between parent and child. Many parents play roles when they speak to young children. They use silly words and sounds. They talk down to the child. They don't treat the child as an equal. The fact that you temporarily know more or that you are physically larger does not mean the child is not your equal. The majority of adults at some point in their lives find themselves being a parent, one of the most universal roles. The all-important question is, are you able to fulfill the function of being a parent and fulfill it well without identifying with that function, that is, without becoming the role? Part of the necessary function of being a parent is looking after the needs of the child, preventing the child from getting into danger, and at times telling the child what to do and not what to do. When being a parent becomes an identity, however, when your sense of self is entirely or largely derived from it, the function easily becomes overemphasized, exaggerated, and takes you over. Giving children what they need becomes excessive and turns into spoiling. Preventing them from getting into danger becomes overprotectiveness and interferes with their need to explore the world and try things out for themselves. Telling children what to do or what not to do becomes over-controlling and overbearing. The author continues this section by explaining how the parental role is often continued way beyond the time when the need for the parental function has passed. Parents cannot let go of being a parent even when the child grows into an adult. They can't let go of the need to be needed by their child. Even when the adult is 40 years old, parents can't let go of the notion, I know what's best for you. The role of the parent is still being played compulsively, and so there is no authentic relationship. Parents define themselves by that role and are unconsciously afraid of loss of identity when they cease being parents. If their desire to control or influence the actions of their adult child is thwarted, as it usually is, they will start to criticize or show their disapproval, or try to make the child feel guilty, all in an unconscious attempt to preserve their role, their identity. On the surface, it looks as if they're concerned about their child, and they themselves believe it, but they are only really concerned about preserving their role identity. All egoic motivations are self-enhancement and self-interest, sometimes cleverly disguised, even from the person in whom the ego operates. Eckhart Tolle continues the section by explaining how a mother or father who is acting unconsciously from a parental role may often attempt to complete themselves through the lives of their children. A mother or father who identifies with the parental role may also try to become more complete through their children. The ego's need to manipulate others into filling the sense of lack it continuously feels is then directed towards them. If the mostly unconscious assumptions and motivations behind the parents' compulsion to manipulate their children were made conscious and voiced, they would probably include some or all of the following. I want you to achieve what I never achieved. I want you to be somebody in the eyes of the world so that I too can be somebody through you. Don't disappoint me. I sacrificed so much for you. My disapproval of you is intended to make you feel so guilty and uncomfortable that you finally conform to my wishes. And it goes without saying that I know what's best for you. I love you, and I will continue to love you if you do what I know is right for you. The author continues by explaining how the key to eliminating this egoic behavioral pattern is first to become aware of it. When you make such unconscious motivations conscious, you immediately see how absurd they are. The ego that lies behind them becomes visible, as does its dysfunction. Some parents that I spoke to suddenly realized, my God, is that what I've been doing? Once you see what you are doing or have been doing, you also see its futility. And that unconscious pattern then comes to an end by itself. Awareness is the greatest agent for change. Eckhart Tolle continues with some advice for older children with parents who are stuck in this egoic mindset. If your parents are doing this to you, do not tell them they are unconscious and in the grip of the ego. That will likely make them even more unconscious because the ego will take up a defensive position. It is enough for you to recognize that this is the ego in them, that it is not who they are. Egoic patterns, even long-standing ones, sometimes dissolve almost miraculously when you don't oppose them internally. Opposition only gives them renewed strength. But even if they don't, you can accept your parents' behavior with compassion without needing to react to it. That is to say, without personalizing it. Be aware also of your own unconscious assumptions or expectations that lie behind your old habitual reactions to them. My parents should approve of what I do. They should understand me and accept me for who I am. Really? Why should they? The fact is, they don't because they can't. Their evolving consciousness hasn't made the quantum leap to the level of awareness yet. They are not yet able to disidentify from their role. Eckhart Tolle continues chapter 4 by examining some of the potential negative thought patterns that a person might have as a result of their parents' unconscious behaviors. Again, awareness and presence are the key to transmuting this egoic behavioral pattern. Be alert. Are some of the thoughts that go through your mind the internalized voice of your father or mother, saying perhaps something like, "You are not good enough, you will never amount to anything," or some other judgment or mental position? If there is awareness in you, you will be able to recognize that voice in your head for what it is, an old thought conditioned by the past. If there is awareness in you, you no longer need to believe in every thought you think. It's an old thought, no more. Awareness means presence, and only presence can dissolve the unconscious past in you. If you think you are so enlightened, Ram Dass said, go spend a week with your parents. That is good advice. The relationship with your parents is not only the primordial relationship that sets the tone for all subsequent relationships, it is also a good test for your degree of presence. The more shared past there is in a relationship, the more present you need to be. Otherwise, you will be forced to relive the past again and again. The author continues chapter 4 with a section titled Conscious Suffering. In this section, Eckhart Tolle explains how young children need space to explore and the freedom to make mistakes on their own. If you have young children, give them help, guidance, and protection to the best of your ability. But even more important, give them space to be. They come into this world through you, but they are not yours. The belief, I know what's best for you, may be true when they are young, but the older they get, the less true it becomes. The more expectations of who you have, how their life should unfold, the more you are in your mind instead of being present for them. Eventually, they will make mistakes and they will experience some form of suffering, as all humans do. In fact, they may be mistakes only from your perspective. What to you is a mistake may be exactly what your children need to do or experience. Give them as much help and guidance as you can, but realize that you may also at times have to allow them to make mistakes, especially as they begin to reach adulthood. At times, you may also have to allow them to suffer. Suffering may come to them out of the blue, or it may come as a consequence of their own mistakes. Wouldn't it be wonderful if you could spare them from all suffering? No, it wouldn't. They would not evolve as human beings and would remain shallow, identified with external form of things. Suffering drives you deeper. The paradox is that suffering is caused by identification with form and erodes identification with form. A lot of it is caused by ego, although eventually suffering destroys the ego, but not until you suffer consciously. The author continues this section by contending that the key to transcending suffering in one's life is to surrender to the idea that suffering is a part of every human's life experience. Humanity is destined to go beyond suffering, but not in the way the ego thinks. One of the ego's many erroneous assumptions, one of its many deluded thoughts is, I should not have to suffer. Sometimes the thought gets transferred to someone close to you. My child should not have to suffer. That thought itself lies at the root of suffering. Suffering has a noble purpose, the evolution of consciousness and the burning up of the ego. The man on the cross is an archetypal image. He is every man and every woman. As long as you resist suffering, it is a slow process because the resistance creates more ego to burn up. When you accept suffering, however, there is an acceleration of that process. which is brought about by the fact that you suffer consciously. You can accept suffering for yourself, or you can accept it for someone else, such as a child or a parent. In the midst of conscious suffering, there is already the transmutation. The fire of suffering becomes the light of consciousness. The ego says, I shouldn't have to suffer. And that thought makes you suffer so much more. It is a distortion of the truth, which is always paradoxical. The truth is that you need to say yes to suffering before you can transcend it. Eckhart Tolle continues with a section titled Conscious Parenting. In this section, the author begins by explaining how children who grow up with parents that are stuck in that role hold anger and resentment towards their parents who are in the grip of the ego. Many children harbor hidden anger and resentment towards their parents, and often the cause is inauthenticity in the relationship. The child has a deep longing for the parent to be there as a human being, not as a role, no matter how consciously that role is being played. You may be doing all the right things and the best you can for your child, but even doing the best you can is not enough. In fact, doing is never enough if you neglect being. The ego knows nothing of being, but believes you will eventually be saved by doing. If you are in the grip of the ego, you believe that by doing more and more, you will eventually accumulate enough doings to make yourself feel complete. At some point in the future, you won't. You will only lose yourself in the doing. Eckhart Tolle continues his conscious parenting section by explaining how to bring presence into daily family life, in addition to exploring the differences between form-based attention and formless attention. How do you bring being into the life of a busy family, into the relationship with your child? The key is to give your child attention. There are two kinds of attention. One we might call form-based attention. The other is formless attention. Form-based attention is always connected in some way with doing or evaluating. Have you done your homework? Eat your dinner, tidy up your room, brush your teeth, do this, stop doing that, hurry up, get ready. What's the next thing we have to do? This question pretty much summarizes what family life is like in many homes. Form-based attention is of course necessary and has its place, but if that's all there is in the relationship with your child, then the most vital dimension is missing, and being becomes completely obscured by doing, by the cares of the world, as Jesus puts it. Formless attention is inseparable from the dimension of being. How does it work? As you look at, listen to, touch, or help your child with this or that, you are alert, still, and being completely present, not wanting anything other than that moment as it is. In this way, you make room for being. In that moment, if you are present, you are not the father or the mother. You are the alertness, the stillness, the presence that is listening, looking, touching, even speaking. You are the being behind the doing. The author continues chapter 4 with a section titled Giving Up Role-Playing. In this section, Eckhart Tolle discusses how role-playing takes place on many levels and always ultimately results in the destruction of the ego. To do whatever is required of you in any situation without it becoming a role that you identify with is an essential lesson in the art of living that each of us is here to learn. You become most powerful in whatever you do if the action is performed for its own sake rather than a means to protect, enhance, or conform to your role identity. Every role is a fictitious sense of self, and through it everything becomes personalized and thus corrupted and distorted by the mind-made little me and whatever role it happens to be playing. Most of the people who are in positions of power in this world, such as politicians, TV personalities, business as well as religious leaders, are completely identified with their role, with few notable exceptions. They may be considered VIPs, but they are no more than unconscious players in the egoic game, a game that looks so important yet is ultimately devoid of true purpose. It is, in the words of Shakespeare, a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Amazingly, Shakespeare arrived at this conclusion without having the benefit of television. If the egoic earth drama has any purpose at all, it is an indirect one. It creates more and more suffering on the planet, and suffering, although largely ego-created, is in the end also ego-destructive. It is in the fire in which the ego burns itself up. Eckhart Tolle continues this powerful section by explaining how true power lies within one's ability to be their authentic self. The author continues this section by exploring how people in positions of influence who act authentically from their true being are making a real difference. In a world of role-playing personalities, those few people who don't project a mind-made image, and there are some even on TV, in the media, and the business world, but function from a deeper core of their being. Those who do not attempt to appear more than they are, but are simply themselves, stand out as remarkable, and are the only ones who make a true difference in this world. They are the bringers of the new consciousness. Whatever they do becomes empowered because it is in alignment with the purpose of the whole world. Their influence, however, goes far beyond what they do, far beyond their function. Their mere presence, simple, natural, unassuming, has a transformational effect on whoever they come into contact with. The author continues this powerful section by explaining how true power lies within one's ability to be their authentic self. When you don't play roles, it means there is no self, no ego in what you do. There is no secondary agenda, protection, or strengthening of yourself. As a result, your actions have far greater power. You are totally focused on the situation. You become one with it. You don't try to be anybody in particular. You are most powerful, most effective when you are completely yourself. The author concludes this section by answering the question, why does the ego play roles? Because of one unexamined assumption, one fundamental error, one unconscious thought, that is, I am not enough. Other unconscious thoughts follow. I need to play a role in order to get what I need to be fully myself. I need to get more so that I can be more. But you cannot be more because you are underneath your physical and physiological form. You are one with life itself, one with being. In form, you are and will always be inferior to some and superior to others. In essence, you are neither inferior nor superior to anyone. True self-esteem and true humility arise out of that realization. In the eyes of the ego, self-esteem and humility are contradictory. In truth, they are one and the same. In the next section of Chapter 4, Eckhart Tolle tackles the subject of the pathological ego. In a wider sense of the word, the ego itself is pathological, no matter what form it takes. When we look at the ancient Greek root of the word pathological, we discover just how appropriate the term is when it is applied to the ego. Although the word is normally used to describe a condition of disease, it is derived from pathos, which means suffering. The author continues this section by explaining how the ego does not recognize suffering as suffering. A person in the grip of the ego, however, does not recognize suffering as suffering, but will look upon it as the only appropriate response in any given situation. The ego, in its blindness, is incapable of seeing the suffering it inflicts on itself and on others. Unhappiness is an ego-created mental emotional disease that has reached epidemic proportions. It is the inner equivalent of the environmental pollution of our planet. Negative states such as anger, anxiety, hatred, resentment, discontent, envy, jealousy, and so on are not recognized as negative, but as totally justified, and are further misperceived not as self-created, but as caused by someone else or some external factor. I am holding you responsible for my pain. This is by implication what the ego is saying. Eckhart Tolle continues this section by examining the ego's pathological negativity and how one's unconscious mental thought patterns create a space for the ego's overtaking. The ego cannot distinguish between a situation and its interpretation of and reaction to that situation. You might say, "What a dreadful day," without realizing that the cold, the wind, and the rain, or whatever condition you react to, are not dreadful. They are as they are. What is dreadful is your reaction, your inner resistance to it, and the emotion that is created by that resistance. In Shakespeare's words, there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. What is more, suffering or negativity is often misperceived by the ego as pleasure, because up to a point, the ego strengthens itself through it. For example, anger or resentment strengthen the ego enormously by increasing the sense of separateness, emphasizing the otherness of others, and creating a seemingly unassailable fortress-like mental position of rightness. If you were able to observe the physiological changes that take place inside your body when possessed by such a negative states, how adversely they affect the functioning of the heart, the digestive and immune system, and countless other bodily functions, it would become abundantly clear that such states are indeed pathological, are forms of suffering and not pleasure. The author continues by explaining how the awareness of the ego's negative state is the key to its shrinking and its inevitable destruction. Whenever you are in a negative state, there is something in you that wants the negativity, that perceives it as pleasurable, or that believes it will get you what you want. Otherwise, who would want to hang on to negativity, make themselves and others miserable, and create disease in the body? So whenever there is negativity in you, if you can be aware at that moment that there is something in you that takes pleasure in it, or believes that it has a useful purpose, you are becoming aware of the ego directly. The moment this happens, your identity has shifted from ego to awareness. This means the ego is shrinking and awareness is growing. Eckhart Tolle concludes his section on the pathological ego by explaining how the ego may be clever, but true intelligence comes when we are authentically in a state of unity consciousness. If, in the midst of negativity, you are able to realize, at this moment I am creating suffering for myself, it will be enough to raise you above the limitations of conditioned egoic states and reactions. It will open up infinite possibilities which will come to you when there is awareness. Other vastly more intelligent ways of dealing with any situation. You will be free to let go of your unhappiness the moment you recognize it as unintelligent. Negativity is not intelligent. It is always of the ego. The ego may be clever, but it is not intelligent. Cleverness pursues its own little aims. Intelligence sees the larger whole in which all the beings are connected. Cleverness is motivated by self-interest, and it is extremely short-sighted. Most politicians and business people are clever. Very few are intelligent. Whatever is attained through cleverness is short-lived and always turns out to be eventually self-defeating. Cleverness divides, intelligence includes. In the next section titled The Background Unhappiness, Eckhart Tolle describes this unconscious state of being as a pathological set of egoic states that create separation and suffering. The most common of these are anger and hatred, but impatience, irritation, and nervousness follow closely behind. The author describes this background unhappiness as many people's predominant inner state. Here is one of the most common negative states that is easily overlooked, precisely because it is so common and so normal. You may be familiar with it. Do you often experience a feeling of discontent that could be best described as a kind of background resentment? It may be either specific or non-specific. Many people spend a large part of their lives in that state. They are so identified with it that they cannot stand back and see it. Underlying that feeling are certain unconsciously held beliefs, that is to say, thoughts. You think these thoughts in the same way that you dream your dreams, when you are asleep. In other words, you don't know you are thinking those thoughts, just as the dreamer doesn't know he is dreaming. Eckhart Tolle concludes this section by providing the reader with a list of the most common unconscious thoughts that create a feeling of discontent or background resentment. Here are the list of unconscious thought examples. There is something that needs to happen in my life before I can be at peace, happy, or fulfilled, and I resent that it hasn't happened yet. Maybe my resentment will finally make it happen. Something happened to me in the past that should not have happened, and I resent that. If that hadn't happened, I would be at peace now. Something is happening now that should not be happening, and it is preventing me from being at peace now. Often the unconscious beliefs are directed toward a person, and so happening becomes doing. For example, you should do this so that I can be at peace, and I resent that you haven't done it yet. Maybe my resentment will make you do it. Something you did, or I did, said, or failed to do in the past is preventing me from being at peace now. What are you doing or failing to do now is preventing me from being at peace. In the next section titled The Secret of Happiness, Eckhart Tolle discusses how to be at peace and be in the now. How to be at peace now, by making peace with the present moment. The present moment is the field on which the game of life happens. It cannot happen anywhere else. Once you have made peace with the present moment, see what happens. What you can do or choose to do rather than what life does through you. There are 3 words that convey the secret of the art of living, the secret of all success and happiness. One with life. Being one with life is being one with now. You then realize that you don't live your life, but life lives you. Life is the dancer, and you are the dance. Eckhart Tolle continues this section by exploring the ego's resentment of reality. The ego loves its resentment of reality. What is reality? Whatever is. Buddha called it ta-ta-ta, the suchness of life, which is no more than the suchness of this moment. Opposition towards that suchness is one of the main features of the ego. It creates the negativity that the ego thrives on, the unhappiness that it loves. In this way, you make yourself and others suffer and don't even know what you are doing. You don't even know that you are creating hell on earth. To create suffering without recognizing it is the essence of unconscious living. This is being totally in the grip of the ego. The extent of the ego's inability to recognize itself and see what it's doing is staggering and unbelievable. It will do exactly what it condemns for others and not see it. When it is pointed out, it will use angry denial, clever arguments, and self-justifications to distort the facts. People do it, corporations do it, and governments do it. When all else fails, the ego will resort to shouting or even physical violence. Send in the Marines. We can now understand the deep wisdom in Jesus' words on the cross. Forgive them, for they know not what they do. Eckhart Tolle continues by explaining that the key to ending suffering is mindfulness and awareness. To end the misery that has afflicted the human condition for thousands of years, You have to start with yourself and take responsibility for your inner state at any given moment. That means now, ask yourself, is there negativity in me at this moment? Then become alert, attentive to your thoughts as well as your emotions. Watch out for the lower level unhappiness in whatever form that I mentioned earlier, such as discontent, nervousness, being fed up, and so on. Watch out for the thoughts that appear to justify or explain this unhappiness, but in reality cause it. The moment you become aware of a negative state within yourself, it does not mean you have failed. It means you have succeeded. Until that awareness happens, there is identification with inner states, and such identification is ego. With awareness comes disidentification from thoughts, emotions, and reactions. This is not to be confused with denial. The thoughts, emotions, or reactions are recognized, and in the moment of recognizing, disidentification happens automatically. Your sense of self of who you are then undergoes a shift. Before, you were the thoughts, emotions, and reactions. Now you are the awareness, the unconscious presence that witnesses those states. The author concludes this section by explaining how to become free of the ego and the awareness that occurs when one transcends it. To become free of the ego is not really a big job, but a very small one. All you need to do is to become aware of your thoughts and emotions as they happen. This is not really a doing, but an alert seeing. In that sense, it is true that there is nothing you can do to become free of the ego. When that shift happens, which is the shift from thinking to awareness, an intelligence far greater than the ego's cleverness begins to operate in your life. Emotions and even thoughts become depersonalized through awareness. Their impersonal nature is recognized. There is no longer a self in them. They are just human emotions, human thoughts. Your entire personal history, which is ultimately no more than just a bundle of thoughts and emotions, becomes of secondary importance and no longer occupies the forefront of your consciousness. It no longer forms the basis for your sense of identity. You are the light of presence, the awareness that is prior to and deeper than any thoughts and emotions. Eckhart Tolle continues Chapter 4 with a section titled Pathological Forms of Ego. In this section, the author explains how the behavioral patterns exhibited by the ego are very similar to characteristics of some mental disorders, particularly paranoid schizophrenia. As we have seen, the ego is in its essential nature pathological. If we use the word in its wider sense to denote a dysfunction and suffering, many mental disorders consist of the same egoic traits that operate in a normal person, except that they have become so pronounced that their pathological nature is now obvious to anyone except the sufferer. For example, many normal people tell certain kinds of lies from time to time in order to appear more important, more special, and to enhance their image in the mind of others, who they know, what their achievements, abilities, and possessions are, and whatever else the ego uses to identify with. Some people, however, driven by the ego's feeling of insufficiency and need to have or be more, lie habitually and compulsively. Most of what they tell you about themselves, their story, is a complete fantasy, a fictitious edifice of the ego has designed for itself to feel bigger, more special. Their grandiose and inflated self-image can sometimes fool others, but usually not for long. It is then quickly recognized by most people as a complete fiction. The mental illness that is called paranoid schizophrenia, or paranoia for short, is essentially an exaggerated form of ego. The author continues this section by elaborating on how the ego acts with similar characteristics to those with paranoid schizophrenia. The mental illness we call paranoia also manifests another symptom that is an element of every ego, although in paranoia it takes on a more extreme form. The more the sufferer sees himself persecuted, spied on, or threatened by others, the more pronounced his sense of being the center of the universe around whom everything revolves, the more special and important he feels as the imagined focal point of so many people's attention. His sense of being a victim, of wronged by so many people, makes him feel very special. In the story that forms the basis of his delusional system, he often assigns himself the role of both the victim and the potential hero who is going to save the world or defeat the forces of evil. The author continues by explaining how the element of paranoia has infiltrated our communities, cultures, and global society. The collection of egos, tribes, nations, and religious organizations also frequently contains a strong element of paranoia. Us against the evil others. It is the cause of much human suffering. The Spanish Inquisition, the persecution and burning of heretics and witches, the relations between nations leading up to the First and Second World Wars, communism throughout its history and the Cold War, McCarthyism in America in the 1950s, prolonged violent conflict in the Middle East, are all painful episodes in human history dominated by extreme collective paranoia. Eckhart Tolle continues Chapter 4 with a section titled Work with and Without Ego. In this section, the author explains that being present in your work is the key to real success in your trade. Most people have moments when they are free of ego. Those who are exceptionally good at what they do may be completely or largely free of ego while performing their work. They may not know it, but their work has become a spiritual practice. Most of them are present while they do their work and fall back into a relative unconsciousness in their private life. This means their state of presence is for the time being confined to one area of their life. I have met teachers, artists, nurses, doctors, scientists, social workers, waiters, hairdressers, business owners, and salespeople who perform their work admirably without any self-seeking, fully responding to whatever the moment requires of them. They are one with what they do, one with the now, one with the people or the task that they serve. The influence such people have on others goes far beyond the function that they perform. They bring about a lessening of the ego in everyone who comes into contact with them. Even people with heavy egos sometimes begin to relax, let their guard down, and stop playing their roles when they interact with them. It comes as no surprise that those people who work without ego are extraordinarily successful at what they do. Anybody who is one with what he or she does is building the new earth. Eckhart Tolle continues Chapter 4 with a section titled The Ego in Illness. In this section, the author explores how one's ego can use an illness to strengthen itself and ultimately become permanently identified with the illness. An illness can either strengthen or weaken the ego. If you complain, feel self-pity, or resent being ill, your ego becomes stronger. It also becomes stronger if you make the illness part of your conceptual identity. I am a sufferer of such and such disease. Some people, on the other hand, who in normal life have a big ego, suddenly become gentle and kind and much nicer people when they are ill. They may gain insights they may never have had before in their normal life. They may access their inner knowing and contentment and speak words of wisdom. Then, when they get better, energy returns, and so does the ego. When you are ill, your energy level is quite low, and the intelligence of the organism may take over and use the remaining energy for the healing of the body. And so there is not enough left for the mind, that is to say, egoic thinking and emotion. The ego burns up considerable amounts of energy. In some cases, however, the ego retains the little energy that remains and uses it for its own purposes. Needless to say, those people who experience a strengthening of the ego in illness take much longer to recover. Some never do, and so the illness becomes chronic and a permanent part of their false sense of self. Eckhart Tolle continues Chapter 4 with a section titled The Collective Ego. In this section, the author discusses how the ego will identify with and attach itself to a group in order to strengthen itself. One of the ways in which the ego attempts to escape the unsatisfactoriness of personal selfhood is to enlarge and strengthen its sense of self by identifying with a group, a nation, a political party, a corporation, institution, sect, club, gang, or football team. In some cases, the personal ego seems to dissolve completely as someone dedicates his or her life to working selflessly for the greater good of the collective without demanding personal rewards or recognition. What a relief to be freed of the dreadful burden of personal self. The members of the collective feel happy and fulfilled no matter how hard they work, how many sacrifices they make. They appear to have gone beyond ego. The question is, have they truly become free? Or has the ego simply shifted from personal to the collective? Because it unconsciously seeks conflict and it needs opposition to define its boundary and thus its identity. Its members will then experience the suffering that inevitably comes in the wake of any ego-motivated action. At this point, they may wake up and realize that their collective has a strong element of insanity. It can be painful at first to suddenly wake up and realize that the collective you had identified with and worked for is actually insane. Some people at that point become cynical or bitter and henceforth deny all values, all worth. This means that they quickly adopted another belief system when the previously one was recognized as illusory and therefore collapsed. They didn't face the death of their ego, but ran away and reincarnated a new one. Eckhart Tolle continues this section by acknowledging the development of the new conscious groups and collectives. As the new consciousness emerges, some people will feel called upon to form groups that reflect the enlightened consciousness. These groups will not be collective egos. The individuals who make up these groups will have no longer the need to define their identity through them. They will no longer look to any form to define who they are. Even if the members that make up those groups are not totally free of ego yet, there will be enough awareness in them to recognize the ego in themselves or in others as soon as it appears. However, constant alertness is required since the ego will try to take over and reassert itself in any way that it can. Dissolving the human ego by bringing it into the light of awareness. This will be one of the main purposes that these groups, whether they will be enlightened businesses, charitable organizations, schools, or communities of people living together, enlightened collectives will fulfill an important function in the arising of the new consciousness. Just as egoic collectives pull you into unconsciousness and suffering, the enlightened collective can be a vortex for consciousness that will accelerate the planetary shift. Ooh, I just got chills. Ooh! Eckhart Tolle concludes Chapter 4 of A New Earth with a section titled Incontrovertible Proof of Immortality. In this fascinating section, the author explores our human life experience from a greater perspective. Ego comes through a split in the human psyche in which identity separates into two parts that we could call I and me, or me and myself. Every ego is therefore schizophrenic, to use the word in its popular meaning of split personality. You live with a mental image of yourself, a conceptual self that you have a relationship with. Life itself becomes conceptualized and separated from who you are when you speak of my life. The moment you say or think my life and believe in what you are saying, rather than just in being a linguistic convention, you have entered the realm of delusion. If there is such a thing as my life, It follows that I and life are two separate things, and so I can also lose my life, my imaginary treasured possession. Death becomes a seemingly reality and a threat. Words and concepts split life into two separate segments that have no reality in themselves. We could even say that the notion my life is the original delusion of separateness, the source of ego. If I and life are two, if I am separate from life, then I am separate from all things, all beings, all people. But how could I be separate from life? What I could there be apart from life, apart from being? It is utterly impossible. So there is no such thing as my life, and I don't have a life. I am life. I and life are one. It cannot be otherwise. So how could I lose my life? How can I lose what I don't have in the first place? How can I lose something that I am? It is impossible. All right, everyone. This concludes my video on Eckhart Tolle's Chapter 4 of A New Earth. Thank you so much for watching my video today. Please like and subscribe to my channel. And stay tuned for my next video on Eckhart Tolle's A New Earth, Chapter 5, The Pain Body. See you on the next video. Eckhart Tolle continues this section by stating some characteristics of the collective ego and the awareness of it. A collective ego manifests the same characteristics as the personal ego, such as the need for conflict and enemies, the need for more, the need to be right against others who are wrong, and so on. Sooner or later, the collective will come into conflict with other collectives.